Okay, so let's get started. So last time, you may want to raise your hand and say what it was that we did last time. Do we remember? What did we talk about last time? Anything at all?
About videos?
No, in this class, in game design last Friday, what did we talk about?
Oh, history of video games up to like the early 80s.
Yeah, video games up to the crash of '83, right? Now, today, we're going to take a step backwards here at the beginning to 1971. So a couple of years before, several years before the launch of Pong, okay? Now, we talked last time about what is the first video game. And I said a lot of people, including the author that wrote The Ultimate History of Video Games, will consider Pong to be the first video game. There's also a video I'm going to put up on Canvas that debates that as well. Now, I chose to consider Pong more or less the first video game for our purposes, because even though it wasn't the first interactive game on a computer or computerized system, it was the first one that really, well, the first hit, I guess, that really represents video games as we understand them today, right? That it has graphics, it has a score, it has rules and that kind of thing, right? Graphics being the most important part. Well, a lot of things that came after the crash of '83, and we'll talk more about this as Kyle can attest in Game Dev 2, we talk about how these text adventures became graphical in the '80s, and the graphics allowed this kind of niche genre of game, which up until that point was limited to people who either were at universities and had access to mainframe computers, or were on like ARPANET or something, or that sort of thing, right? And then they go graphical, and Final Fantasy comes out, that kind of stuff, and they kind of go mainstream. So today we are going to talk about the golden age of text adventures. Could you switch those light switches for me, please? I thought I turned the right one on, but I clearly didn't. It just occurred to me when I turned it on earlier that I'm the one that messed that up. I was like, oh, the maintenance people messed it up. No, it was definitely me this morning when I came in. Okay, so the golden age of text adventures. So here is our timeline of major events. Let's see, is my clicker working? Because if my clicker's working, I'm gonna move around a little bit. Okay. So in 1971, Mike Mayfield, David H. All, and Bob Leadham released Star Trek. In '73, Gregory Yob releases Hunt the Wumpus. 2 years later, Will Crowther releases Colossal Cave Adventure. That's going to be one of the most important ones we're going to talk about, Colossal Cave Adventure. In '77, Infocom releases the game Zork, the same year that Apple releases the Apple II. Okay, I'm gonna go back one slide real quick. I can remember if I had this on the next slide or not. There are also two other, the Commodore PET and the TRS Tandy TRS, excuse me, were both, oh shoot, I meant to bring in, I've got an old Radio Shack Tandy TRS comic book that I got at a antique mall not too long ago. It's like in the plastic seal and everything. What would happen is you would go in and you would buy a computer at Radio Shack, like one of their computers, and they would give you a free comic book that starred these brother and sister twins that were like detectives, and they used their Tandy computer to solve crimes. That was like, and so anyway, I meant to bring it in and I forgot. But that same year in '77, and I'll talk about this here in a minute, we had the Trinity of '77, which was the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the Tandy TRS. In '78, Scott Adams releases Adventureland, and that's not the Dilbert Scott Adams, by the way. A lot of people think that they mess that up and think, oh yeah, it's the guy that made Dilbert. No, it's a different Scott Adams. A much older Scott Adams, actually. In '79, Infocom releases the Z Machine, which basically was a language, if you will, or an engine that allowed the creation of text-based adventures a lot easier, so they could kind of expedite the process. In 1980, Sierra releases Wizard and the Princess, which is graphical. Okay, so we start kind of see that foray into graphics. In '82, Infocom releases Deadline, popularizing the concept of feelies. We'll talk about that more here in a minute, but it's basically physical items that come in the box with the game. And so that way, if you want to pirate the game, you won't be able to finish it because you need some physical item that would have come in the box that you don't have access to. I actually did a puzzle one time with my family that was, I guess, kind of like this. Not really, but sort of. You put this puzzle together. So like phase 1 is you put together the puzzle. Phase 2 is, well, phase 1 is you read a synopsis of a crime that occurred. Phase 2 is you put the puzzle together, and phase 3 is you use the puzzle to solve the crime. And it was really, really, really cool. Like I remember like my whole family, we spent like a Saturday afternoon like reading like the crime notes and putting the puzzle together and stuff. We didn't solve it, but it was really, really cool. In '82, Softline magazine writes, the demands of the market are weighted heavily toward high-res graphics. Okay, so we start seeing people's tastes sort of switching to graphical games. In '84, Infocom releases The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And then 2 years later, after the failure of Cornerstone, Infocom is bought by Activision, ending the era. Now, that's not to say that there has never been a text adventure since then. There have been many. But the golden age ends at that point. All right, so here's Star Trek from '71, released by Mike Mayfield for the SDS Sigma 7 mainframe computer, written in BASIC. So if you look on, like, say, you probably, I don't know if you can see it, but like on line 210, which is like right over, where did it go? Line 210. Oh, there we go. Line 210. It's got an if statement, right? If you've never seen BASIC before, if you have never seen BASIC before, imagine Python without the tabs and spaces. Like imagine if you could write Python code and do whatever you wanted with tabs and spaces. That's more or less basically what BASIC is. And if you're interested in BASIC, I want to throw this out while I'm thinking of it. I'm going to install Batari BASIC on one of those computers back there, which allows you to use a BASIC dialect to write games that will run on the Atari 2600. You can actually put them on a cartridge and everything and actually run them on an actual system. So if you're interested in that, it'll be available to you. And it attempted to create a game similar to Space War. Now, remember Space War from last time, right? Where you've got the black hole in the middle of the screen, and your ship gets pulled into it, and you fly around, and you're trying to shoot like another ship that also is doing something, right? It's a really complicated game. Imagine playing that in text form, right? It's hard enough when you can see what's going on. Now imagine you're trying to like, envision what is happening and make text-based commands based on that knowledge. This is Hunt the Wumpus from '73. It's set in a series of caves. It is turn-based and allows the player to shoot arrows as well as move. And the goal is to hunt down and kill the titular Wumpus. The text on the screen here says, you're in room 3. Tunnels lead to 2, 4, and 12. Shoot or move. They said move. Where to? They said 12. You're in room 12. I smell a Wumpus. Okay? Tunnels lead to 3, 11, 13. Shoot or move. They said shoot. Number of rooms, 1. Room number 13. You got the Wumpus. He. The Wumpus will get you next time. Same setup, yes or no. Now you're in room 2. I feel a draft. Tunnels lead to 1, 3, and the game starts over. Okay. Colossal Cave Adventure. Here's your granddaddy of text-based adventures. Most tropes that show up in later text-based games, as well as most tropes that you will hear me refer to when I talk about text-based games, like in 120 and things like that, I'm making references to Colossal Cave Adventure. Okay, it was written in Fortran by cave enthusiast Will Crowther for the PDP-10 mainframe computer. If you're not familiar with Fortran, you should look it up sometime. It is a trip of a language, let me tell you. It's loosely based on the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. Fun little side note to that. Everybody ever heard of the game Kentucky Route Zero? Really? Wow. Okay. Go out and play Kentucky Route Zero. It's a lot of fun. It's like a surrealist art game kind of thing. It's like at one point some guy turns into a skeleton and like he's like radioactive. It's a really interesting game. But anyway, it's also set around the Mammoth Cave system area of Kentucky. It was known as Advent due to file name limits. You can only have 8 characters. And then in 1977, Don Woods revised the game and added fantasy elements inspired by Lord of the Rings. You have Will Crowther there on the left and Don Woods there on the right. So I want you to think about that for a second. Okay, so Will Crowther on the left there, he wrote this in Fortran. Okay, and this is at a time when like most people were not computer programmers. Like learning Fortran would have been incredibly difficult, especially to do things like being able to add items to an inventory, go to different rooms, enter commands, have like text parsing and things like that. I mean, that would have been very, very difficult to learn. And he made this game so that his daughters had something fun to play when they came to his house. And it's just insane to like I can't imagine going out of my own on my own accord to learn this complicated language that like there wouldn't have been an internet or I mean the manual. I can't even imagine what manual he would have used. I don't know how long he knew Fortran. I mean, I assume he knew a little bit about it beforehand, but it's just crazy to me to think. So anyway, Will Crowther, Don Woods. This is Zork from 1977. It's set in the ruins of an ancient empire lying far underground. Features the first appearance of the ferocious but light-fearing Grooves, who reappear in later Infocon games. And unlike many games of the era, the player is not limited to simple commands such as get lamp. Get lamp is the name of that documentary I told you about. It is a command from the very beginning of Colossal Cave Adventure. There's a creek running nearby. There's a shack next to you. If you go into the shack, it says there is a lamp on a table. If you type get lamp, it will give you the lamp. You have to have the lamp to go into the cave. So it's possible you could make it all the way to the cave and have to turn around and go all the way back because you have no way to get in. Right? So get lamp is kind of a common command there. If you look at the bottom of the image there, get leaflet. There's a leaflet in the mailbox. Examine mailbox. Open mailbox. Right? There is your location west of house is in the top left there in that little gray box. On the right-hand side, you have score and moves. A lot of these old games would deduct from your score every move that you made, so you're trying to beat the game in as few moves as possible, or some system, some derivative thereof, so that like the less moves you make, the more points you have at the end of the game, however they would calculate that. And then there's description, west of house. You were standing in an open field west of a white house with a boarded front door. There's a small mailbox here. Okay. Here's the Apple II, released in '77, along with the Tandy TRS and the Commodore PET, considered the trinity of '77, and they helped to usher in the personal computer revolution. If you remember from last semester, the only people that had computers really were who at this time? There were two groups primarily.
Like governments.
Yep.
And schools.
Yeah, and that would be a good third one too. Yes, corporations as well. Corporations. Even then, though, interestingly enough, corporations really not so much. Not especially compared to the other two. They had them, yes, but corporations, schools, and the government. The idea of a personal computer in the home was unheard of. What kind of a geek would want a computer in their house? Like you're so worried about numbers, you got to be calculating numbers all day long, like all day and all night. But anyway, yeah, this was the Apple II. There's the Commodore PET there on the left, the Apple II, of course, in the middle, with 2 disk drives. That's what that is there. So in this one, they have a cassette tape drive. Cassette tape, just like you would like an audio cassette, like you'd listen to, but it has data on it instead. And then 2 Pong paddle controllers. Okay, the one in the middle there doesn't have those other 2 things. It instead has 2 floppy drives, which I find interesting. And there on the right, that's the TRS Tandy. You may recall when I did my interview with Mr. Daniel Snyder last year, or yeah, last school year. He mentioned that he got into programming on a knockoff version of one of these that had a cartridge that you could put into it that had BASIC on it. And he said, I asked him, I said, do you recall the first program you ever wrote? And he said, oh yeah, I remember every moment of that. Every second of that moment. He said, I remember his dad was a programmer and his grandma she worked in the St. Louis public school system, so she had access to these like knockoff Tandys, and she gave him one. And he was like, I was looking at the manual and it was like, okay, so like, open this program up or whatever and type X equals Dan, which was his name. And then on the next line, you type out print, it is nice to meet you plus name, just like we do in Python. And he said, I hit enter and it said, it is nice to meet you, Dan. And he said, my life was changed forever. He said you cannot imagine what it's like. And I said, oh no, I can absolutely imagine, because I remember the first time I ever programmed something, because I also did it in BASIC and he was the one helping me learn how to do it. And I said, whenever you had me do that and it printed out it is nice to meet you, Ross, or whatever. My mind was blown, But anyway, so yeah, now we have the computers in the home, which sets the stage for games like Adventureland, Wizard and the Princess, right, which we can see is graphical. We have the pixely image there at the top, and then the commands and the descriptions there at the bottom. Deadline, it's a detective game. I told you about that one. It introduced the concept of feelies. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second. If we hadn't had the Trinity of 77, do you think this game would be in people's homes? No, of course not. They'd have to play it at school, or play it on their government computer at their government job, or whatever, or play it at work when they're supposed to be working or something, right? Now, here are some feelies that came with the game. The top one up there, tablets found near the body. The one there on the right is a coroner's report. The one on the bottom left there is like a chalk outline of a dead body with like a knocked over chair and some things like that. And then on the right is a letter to you, the chief of detectives, from this Warren Coates person. I'm not sure who that is. I've never played the game, I'm not sure. But anyway, so if you were going to play this game, you would absolutely need these things to complete the game. And the people that tried to pirate it, they just had someone make them a copy of the game, they wouldn't be able to complete it because they didn't have the feelies, right? Okay, now in 1985, we get the Oregon Trail, done by the Minnesota Educational Consortium or something like that, MEC, something. Anyway, now you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with text-based adventure games? Anybody want to wager a guess? Huh?
It's text-based.
Yeah, I mean, it's a text-based game, right? The only difference is this one's educational, right? And it has animations, right? Like as you're moving along, the little ox is going to be animated, right? And you're going to have, like, things will pop up, and your description is here, and there's all kinds of, there's like information here. And you can kind of see how this is sort of the forerunner to games like Ultima 4, right? So, I mean, it's not hard to trace the line from a game like this to a game like this to a game like this to finally a game like this, right? It's a very, very straight line to that point, okay? Now, the era is now over. What were some factors that led to this? Well, first of all, competition from graphical games. Nobody wanted to buy a game, first of all, a game that, like, if I want to borrow my friend's copy, I got to borrow this entire giant box full of stuff, right? And they were getting frustrated with that. The other thing is that they wanted graphics. They wanted to see what was going on. When it says, you're standing before a mailbox, they want to see the dang mailbox, right? They're expecting it because they're going into the arcades and they're playing things like Donkey Kong, or go back a little further, things like Space Invaders and Galaga and Pac-Man, that kind of stuff. They're not walking in there and it's saying, okay, you're piloting a spaceship. Up above you are different spaceships. What do? You shot a bullet. It missed. What do? You shot a bullet. It hit a spaceship, right? They know what they're going in there and they're flying the spaceship around, doing cool stuff. Desire for more diverse game genres. Okay, you're pretty much limited to like exploration and role-playing games. That's pretty much all you can do in text, right? Even if you incorporate some graphics, if we go back to the slide here of Oregon Trail, even if you incorporate graphics, I mean, what is this but a Pioneer-themed role-playing game, right? That's what Oregon Trail is. It's a Pioneer-themed role-playing game. There's not a whole lot that you can really do when you only have text and when your entire game concept is built around entering commands, right? You couldn't do a platformer like this, a sports game. I mean, you could do some of that stuff maybe, but like no one would want to play it. No one would want to play a sports game where you're entering commands and it's just like issuing back like you scored a touchdown or whatever. Like I went to see the touchdown happen. And then finally, the release of the NES in 1986. Okay? All right, so that's the golden era of text-based games. I mentioned I was going to go through that fairly quickly because I really want to get to this, which other than next week, I haven't put it up yet. Other than next week, which we'll talk about the console wars, which is, and we'll watch the documentary Console Wars, which if you haven't seen it, it's really good, and I'm very excited about it. This is probably my second favorite unit that we do, because it's so cool to see this and to think about what could have been if this had not happened. Okay, so like a phoenix from the ashes, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Okay, so it's 1983. The video game was in trouble. Video games became a dirty word. Nobody wanted anything to do with them. Companies would not touch the industry. If you went to somebody and you said, "Hey, I want to make video games," they would say, "Hey, you're going to be poor because no one's going to invest in you. No one wants anything to do with video games." Many people believe they were a fad, like the hula hoop, right? That there was never ever going to be a time that video games would be culturally relevant ever again. Video games are a thing of the past. Okay? And then in 1983 in Japan, same year as the crash, after a series of arcade hits, Nintendo, this company that used to make playing cards and other little novelties and things like that, releases this little console called the Family Computer, known popularly as the Famicom. Okay, a couple of things about Nintendo. Nintendo was a toy manufacturer after being a card manufacturer. Gunpei Yokoi, that invented the Game Boy and other things, invented a those extendable arms that they have that you do like this with the thing, and it was a claw. It was like a hand, like this, I think. That he made to amuse himself. And Yoshi Fukushima, I think is it. Anyway, the CEO, the president of Nintendo at the time, saw it and he was like, "Make that. We're going to sell it," and it became the first toy they made. And then in the 1970s, as we talked about last time, they started releasing some like Pong clones, like some dedicated consoles that had a couple of games wired into them, things like that. And then in '83, they released this. Okay, so I say all that to say, a lot of people act like it was like, oh, Nintendo was making playing cards, and one day they launched a console. Like, no, there was a lot of other stuff that led up to that. They did toys, they did the at-home like dedicated consoles, they did arcade games, and then finally they did the Famicom. Okay, so it wasn't like just some golden goose that just showed up overnight. And no pun intended. I forgot that it had gold on there. No pun intended. But the controllers were hardwired into the console. That's one thing I want to mention. Not like on the NES where you plug them in. They were literally hardwired into the machine. On the Famicom, interestingly, you may notice there, Controller 2 has a microphone built into it, okay? And some games, like The Legend of Zelda, use that feature, okay? If you've ever played the original Legend of Zelda and you've ever read the manual, it mentions that Poe's voice hates loud noises. For decades, players could not figure out what that meant, and the reason is because the NES doesn't have a microphone. If you play the Famicom version and you make any sort of noise into that microphone and there are Poe's voices on screen, they all die. That's what that means. So, a couple of years later, they released an add-on in Japan called the Famicom Disk System, the FDS. Many NES classics, so ones that we got here in America, began their life as Famicom Disk System games, such as The Legend of Zelda, Mario Bros. And Mario Bros. 2, and Metroid. Okay. Now, when I say Mario Bros. 2, I'm referring both to the Japanese Mario 2 and the American Mario 2 that began as Doki Doki Panic. When it was Doki Doki Panic, it was a disk system game, and they converted it to a cartridge for its release in America. Users could also visit special game kiosks to write a new game to a Famicom disk system disc. Can you imagine Nintendo doing something like that now? Being like, yeah, just bring your disc in, your floppy disk that is it's not the same as the floppy disks that were on the market, but like this easily piratable disc, bring it in, and we will give you not a free game, but like we'll just write a new game to it. You better hope nobody gets a hold of a disc writer, because if they do, now everybody's got a copy of it, right? So it's just crazy to imagine Nintendo doing something like that. Okay, then in '83, same year that it released in Japan, they teased at the Consumer Electronics Show that year the Nintendo Advanced Video System. Okay, notice that game, console, cartridge, controller, none of that stuff is there, right? In fact, the included peripherals, other than I guess these non-controller controllers down here and this joystick, but it had a cassette reader, a joystick, and a keyboard, as well as a basic cartridge. Okay, so it was a computer, right? This is not a game console. This is a cassette reader for data and a joystick and a. This is like a weird. It's a gun. It's kind of hard to describe. If you should look the full picture up, but it's kind of like a gun stick thing. It's really weird. But anyway, and then these two controllers that kind of look like what the NES controller eventually became, right? And then a keyboard built right in, just like the Sinclair computer in the United Kingdom. As you might be guessing, though, this never materialized. And I should mention, there's a number of reasons it never materialized. One of the biggest ones being that, like, the crash had just happened. The crash affected other markets too, but Japan was almost not impacted at all. Like the impact on Japan was very, very minor, and as a result, it's kind of hard to explain. But basically, like, because of the joystick and like all the other stuff, this was too much like a console, right? Like nobody wanted to get involved. As cool as it was, nobody wanted to get involved. So instead, 2 years later, in October of '85, they do a limited release. They did it at like FAO Schwartz in New York and a couple of like big venues like that, mostly on the East Coast, and then nationwide February of the next year. It used a front load slot closer to resemble a VCR than a game console. Okay, think about that for a second. Okay, they were trying so hard to convince people this was not a video game console, right? This isn't a game console. Nothing to see here. Look away, right? No. This is an entertainment system. See, look, you put it in the front, just like a VCR, right? It features a D-pad, a directional pad, rather than a directional button. Okay, go back a slide here. You can see that these are a square that have 4 directions on them. They're a directional button as opposed to the D-pad, which you can't see in this picture here, but you know what a D-pad looks like. Okay, it eventually sold 34 million units, and interestingly, the best 3 selling games are Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3. All right, it also came with some interesting peripherals. The NES Zapper. 2 different models there, an orange one and a gray one. The Power Glove in the bottom right-hand corner, and the NES Advantage, which is an arcade stick up there at the top. They also have turbo settings. The NES Advantage does. That's if you're playing a game that you need to be constantly firing and you don't want to sit there and press the button a million times. You put it on turbo and just hold the button down. Turns it into like a fully automatic button, basically. And the Power Glove, quick note on it. You might notice that it has an NES controller like built into like the top of it. That's because in addition to using those number buttons at the top to like enter the code you need to make it work with the game you're wanting to play, you actually can play the game with the controller portion. You can take the glove off and actually play it with the controller. Now, why in the world that's a feature, I have the faintest idea. But the Power Glove is an interesting little piece of technology. I will post the video that talks about the history of the Power Glove because it's fascinating. Originally, it had like liquid in it, and it like used like the density of the liquid moving around to like determine different things. What eventually happened was Nintendo invented an infrared system that would allow you tape these like little square sensors to the edges of the TV, and it could infrared, like the little thing in the front right here has a sensor on it, and it actually kind of like you can drive. In like Rad Racer, you can like do this kind of stuff to like steer the car and different things like that. Like that's the idea that you use it to like, or to like shoot, you make a fist and different things like that, like in shooting games. Okay, speaking of, oh, not yet. Let's watch a little. This is like a 2-hour video. We're obviously not gonna watch the whole thing. I just want to show you a little snippet of Duck Hunt here. If you're not familiar with what Duck Hunt is or how it works, everybody does, I think. Then if you miss, the dog comes up and he laughs at you and things like that. You can shoot sporting clays and different things like that. Now I'm not going to go back and do this because I don't think I can get it right on the frame. But did you notice that whenever it makes the sound, which means you're pulling the trigger, that there was a little white square where the duck used to be? So this game will not run on non-CRT televisions. And the reason is because all CRT televisions have the same refresh rate. And this game is built around being able to know exactly when the refresh occurs. So what happens is when you pull the trigger, the screen goes black for 1 frame, and it draws all the ducks on the screen as white blocks. And if the sensor in the gun lines up with the white square, the corresponding white square, it does the animation of the duck being shot, and you get the points. The problem is, if your monitor or TV refreshes at a different rate than it's expecting, it doesn't. I'm not an engineer, so I don't fully understand it. But basically, it has to do with the sensor doesn't work properly. And I also, as I understand it, it can't sense it at all in some cases because it has to do with the way that like images are projected from a CRT television as opposed to the way that they're done on like an LED or something. So you actually can get this game on the Virtual Console, but it's a like redone version that they did that like uses the Wiimote. It puts a cursor on screen and stuff like that. It's like a modded version essentially that Nintendo did. Okay, and speaking of peripherals and the Power Glove, let's check this video out. Very, very irritating. Sorry, just a second. Okay. Didn't set this up because I didn't think I'd have to.
What is that? I don't know. Power glove. Jeez. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Gets me every time. But anyway, okay, so a couple of quick things about that. First of all, that scene was trimmed because the point is him saying that line. They need a little bit of setup for it. In the actual scene, it goes on for like 30 or 40 seconds of him demonstrating different things he can do with the Power Glove and how good he is and everything. It doesn't make sounds like that. It's not like bloop, 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 bloop. It doesn't do that. It just like you just put the code in. It also doesn't work. That's the big thing about the Power Glove is like it doesn't really work because the technology in 1985 or 7 or 6 or whatever year it was, it's just not there, right? Like the technology just is not there, and it would not be realized until the Wii was released, right? And then we really have true motion sensing and things like that, and wireless controllers and such. But another point on that is, show of hands, anybody ever seen the movie that's from? Dawn, you've seen it. You've seen it too. Cool, perfect. I really want to get a copy and have it like available for checkout in the library or something, because if you've not seen it, I really want you to see it. It's a terrible movie. It's so bad. Not like the Power Glove. It's bad in a different way. It's really awful. But two things on it. One, I have a lot of nostalgia for it because I was like probably 8 when I saw it the first time, and it was on Nickelodeon one afternoon, and I watched it, and it blew my mind. Because the whole game, and the other point I was going to make, is it's a 90-minute commercial for Nintendo. Because at the very end of the movie, so the premise of the movie is the youngest kid in that scene is like it's kind of like Tommy from the Who album, right? He's like a savant. He's autistic and he doesn't talk. He's nonverbal, but he's a video game wizard. And so they're going to a video game competition in California, and they want to take him along. There's more to it than that, but they're taking him along, and at the end of it, he's winning the tournament. He's like, it's him that's like final guy, and he's like gonna win the tournament, and they announced, they're like, okay, so like right before, as I mentioned, right before this, they spend like the whole night on the phone with the Nintendo like tip line, being like, okay, how do you beat this game? How do you beat this game? Like learning all these tips and stuff to get to as best they can. And then they announce Mario 3. And that's the final game they have to play. Competitively Mario 3. The thing is, no one in America knew about that game at the time. It was in Japan, but that was Nintendo's like announcement of that game to North America. So they funded the movie. It's full of Nintendo references. They're playing Double Dragon, all constantly doing stuff like that. But anyway, so that's the Power Glove. I always like to make sure to talk about that for just a minute because it's just so bizarre, right? It's such a bizarre moment. I just can't imagine a game company coming out with such a bizarre peripheral. You know, there's some strange ones, but I can't see something like that coming out these days. Okay. Nope. This one. There we go. This is Rob. You may know Rob. It stands for Robotic Operating Buddy. It was intended to make the NES more toy-like. Anything they could do to make this thing look like a toy or a VCR or a paperweight or a hat, you know, anything that isn't a game console, they're going to make it do that. It was planned to be compatible with many NES games, but in the end, it was only compatible with 2, Gyromite and Stack Up. And barely so in that case. So the way Rob works, well, I'll explain this in a second. So he has made major or cameo appearances in the years since, most recently in 2008's Super Smash Bros. So if you played Smash Bros. Brawl, you may recall that he's the final unlockable character, and so on. The way that Rob works, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry. There we go. The way that Rob works is you hook him up to, let's see, he's got a sensor. Okay, so you hook up the console, so you can see, if you look at this, this isn't what the NES looks like, and that's not what the controllers look like, and that's not what the blaster looks like, right? So this is obviously a very, very, very early ad for the NES. But the idea is that you plug in your cartridge into the NES, and you have it hooked up to your TV, and you have your controller here. Okay. Now, in some instances, it's kind of an honor system scenario. So, like, you would turn Rob to face the TV, and he would do certain things, like on Stack Up, for example. Like, I think it's on Stack Up. He would, like, you just had to, like, oh, looks like he did it, yay, like that kind of a thing. Like, he actually stacked him. Like, there was no way to confirm that in the game. In the other, I can't remember which one it was. I think that was Stack Up that's like that. In the other one, you actually have to put the controller on him. There's like a mount like right here for where the controller goes, and his little arms come down and like press the buttons and do different things, like open door. That's on Gyromite, I'm pretty sure, and it'll like open doors for you and stuff. Like you'll tell like, hey, open this door, and he'll be like, zzz, zzz, beep, and like press the button. Now, I did that super duper fast. It's kind of like that robot that we saw, like that could write with a pen, with a quill pen, right? It takes it forever to write anything. It's kind of what Rob was like. He was not the cutting edge of technology, even in 1985. Okay, something else. Rules and regulations. Nintendo's seal of quality, which was intended to prevent poor quality games from flooding the market. As you may recall, loss of publishing control and a flooded market of crappy games is one of the major causes of the crash of '83, right? And so Nintendo put the seal of quality on there, basically saying, hey, if you see this, you know that we put our stamp on it, right? I remember seeing the Nintendo seal of quality, right? And I remember thinking to myself, like, man, the Nintendo seal of quality, wow. Like, they went through and they tested this game, like, they really knew. Looking back, that's definitely not what happened. It was a scenario like, you pay us enough money, we'll put the seal on it, it doesn't matter. But I was like, wow, they really care about me, the consumer. No, they don't. It also featured a lockout chip, which prevented you from running unauthorized software. Now, if you've ever heard of the game Bible Adventures, or for the game Super 3D Noah's Ark, or both of which, by the way, are available on Steam. There was a company called Wisdom Tree Games that made Bible-themed, unauthorized Bible-themed games for the NES and later on for the Super Nintendo that had the lockout chip. Basically, reverse manufactured the lockout chip so that it would think it was a no. Sorry, I'm telling you that wrong. I'm telling you that wrong. It depending on which company you're talking about. Wizardry, I'm pretty sure it's like a game genie, I think is how it works or something. Like you have to put like a legal cartridge in top of it, so it has the chip to override it. I think it's, and then other companies like reverse manufacturing and things like that. They had rules that developers could do no more than 5 games per year per developer. Now, was it Tengen? I think. Pretty sure it was Tengen. No, it was Atari. Atari's Ultra Games. Ultra Games was like Atari's label they used so they could get past that. So they're like, we'll just start a new publisher, right? And so we can do 20 games a year or whatever. They use terms like control deck instead of console, game pack instead of cartridge. They had strict content rules. They said no to misleading marketing. Like when people get a game, they pick the box up, they're going to know what they're getting into, right? They're not going to be tricked into buying some game that doesn't look anything like what it does on the box, okay? So let's talk about a couple of these real quick. There's the seal of quality. Over here, this is for Pac-Man. Insert the Pac-Man game pack into your Nintendo Entertainment System. Turn on your Nintendo Entertainment System. In a few moments, the Pac-Man title screen will appear. Now, on step 3, it does say, press the start button to begin the one-player game. Now, it's worth pointing out that Pac-Man was a later release, so by the time that the NES had really gotten a foothold, it was kind of okay to start talking about games again. But if you read the manual for like Mario Bros. 1, like, no, there's like no, those like launch titles, there was no mention of it being like a game console. The word game, I don't even know if it shows up anywhere in those manuals. Strict content rules. In this example, I forget which game this is, but in the Japanese version, there's the swastika, the Nazi swastika. Here's another one here. Here's a Nazi doing the Nazi salute. In the US version, it's an eagle, and he's still doing the Nazi salute, but he could be doing just about anything if you didn't have the swastika next to him, right? And then over here, in the Japanese version, we have crosses on these tombstones. We have a skeleton of like a dead duck, like some other DuckTales character that died here, right? In the American version, I'm not sure where Uncle Scrooge. Oh, no, yes, I do. He's up here. He's up here on this platform. But see, no skeleton. R.I.P. Rest in peace instead of the cross. Religious symbolism was banned. Nazi symbolism, nudity definitely was banned because you had games in the Atari in the first 2 generations, the Atari era, like Custer's Revenge and games that literally have titles so vulgar I can't say them in class and things like that because they'd lost publishing control, and so people were like, I'm not buying my kid an Atari to play those dirty, filthy games, you know, and that kind of thing, and they didn't want that to happen, so there's a lot of strict content filtering. The thing about no misleading marketing. Mario on the left pretty much looks like Mario on the right. Yeah? Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's take this example from the Atari 2600. I don't really think, now I chose this example for 2 reasons. One, because the artwork on the box looks nothing like what actually occurs in the game, right? I totally just realized there's a catapult down here. I totally just realized on his like chest there's a catapult. I didn't know that's what these were supposed to be. I thought they were like little like ships or something. They're catapults. Interesting. I never noticed that before. The other reason I chose it is because it's my favorite Atari game. And as a kid, I remember I bought an Atari when I was working at the I said as a kid, when I was in high school. I bought a 2600 Junior, as well as like 10 games with like all the manuals and stuff from this guy who used to come in the movie theater where I worked all the time. And one of them was Warlords. And I remember looking at the cartridge and the booklet and being like, I don't know what this game's gonna be, but man, I'm excited. And I put it in and it was that. And I was like, I feel misled. I feel like the box did not deliver what it promised. All right. So let's watch us a little video here about when a 9-year-old sued Nintendo. Okay. If we have time here in just a minute at the very end, we have 2 videos to watch here. If we have time, I've got one more I want to show you. If not, I'll post it on Canvas. So let's check this out.
On October 22, 1989, Nick Tiemann took his son, Clark, to a Child World toy store in Westport, Connecticut. For the past few years, Clark had been saving money by collecting soda cans and bottles at a nearby athletic field. Now he was finally ready to cash in and buy a new game for his Nintendo Entertainment System. After browsing the titles, Clark settled on a sports game, LJN's Major League Baseball, with a retail price of $39.99. As soon as they got home, Clark ripped off the shrink wrap and popped in the game to play. LJN's Major League Baseball was the first game on the NES to have an official MLB license, meaning the game could use MLB team names and logos. However, it did not have a license from the MLB Players Association, which meant no player names were in the game. Instead, players were represented by stats and uniform numbers. That didn't sit well with Clark. Where were all of his favorite players? And how come the rosters weren't up to date? Upset, he went to his dad. "This isn't what I thought it was," Clark said. "We'll take it back," replied his dad. Nick and Clark headed back to Child World, hoping to return the game. But the store refused. Once the shrink wrap had been broken, the store couldn't give a refund. Nick and Clark could only exchange the game for a new copy, and only if theirs was defective. Nick Tiemann decided to contact Nintendo of America, claiming that the game was misrepresented. Unless you know all the numbers of the baseball players, you don't know who anyone is. If I'm a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old and I'm buying the game right now, I'd like to have Ricky Henderson on my team. In this game, he is a Yankee, he said. But Nintendo of America ignored him. At that point, Nick, a lawyer, decided to take matters into his own hands. On January 16, 1990, Nick and Clark Tiemann sued Nintendo of America, LJN, and Major League Baseball. The Tiemanns claimed that the game's packaging violated the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act, which prohibited unfair and deceptive acts and practices in trade and commerce. They filed the suit as a class action, which would allow others who purchased LJN's Major League Baseball to join in. The Tiemanns hoped to prevent Nintendo and LJN from selling the game as it was packaged, or force them to sell it with new packaging that was less deceptive. In addition, they wanted punitive damages, attorney fees, and finally, a $40 refund on their purchase. The press jumped all over the story. Some found the situation amusing. Jim Taylor of the Province newspaper in Vancouver wrote, "When you were 9 years old, how hard would your parents have laughed, or possibly smacked your butt, if you'd asked them to line up an appointment with a lawyer?" After several delays, lawyers for Nintendo of America filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit on April 4, 1990. The reason? A failure to state a cause of action. In other words, Nintendo was saying, so what? Even if everything the Tiemanns stated was true, they had no legal recourse. LJN's Major League Baseball was released in April of 1988 and developed in 1987, 2 years prior to Clark's purchase. The rosters were accurate at the time of development. The game also never claimed to have player names, just that each team was, quote, represented with its own full roster. Clark Tiemann felt otherwise. The game promised that players could simulate being a manager, but without player names, Clark couldn't choose who to put on the field. His attorney, Lawrence Kanaga, stated, Tiemann discovered it contained insufficient data to allow him to make the managerial decisions it promised. In the U.S. District Court in New Haven, Connecticut, both sides argued their case, and on December 28, 1990, Judge Ellen Burns made her decision. Case dismissed. It was a victory for Nintendo. The Tiemanns appealed, but their appeal was eventually withdrawn. As for LJN's Major League Baseball, despite its lack of player names and multiple glitches, the game sold more than 1 million copies. Was LJN guilty of false advertising on their game? According to the law, no. But it wouldn't be the only time one of their products had questionable marketing. The web series Angry Video Game Nerd pointed out a problem on the LJN Video Art box.
And just to add insult to injury, on the box, the panda is colored in perfectly. How can you market it as a coloring program when there isn't even a way to color anything in?
Nintendo of America wouldn't be strangers to further lawsuits from children. In 1991, a teenager claimed the NES gave her carpal tunnel syndrome. Another claimed the game Kid Icarus caused an epileptic seizure. Although the case never went anywhere, it's always interesting to see a consumer, especially a 9-year-old, fight back. That's all for this episode of The Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so I mentioned no like deceptive marketing, right? What do you think? What do we think? What's our consensus on that? Was regardless of whether or not the case had legal merit, were they in the right? Was LJN being misleading?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I agree. I don't think LGN was misleading.
You don't think they were misleading?
If they don't say that they have the player's name,
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah.
and there has to be a reasonable expectation of the time. So if they made it in '87, if the rosters are right in '87, you have to have a reasonable expectation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I would say the bigger issue here is not necessarily that they were being deceptive in their marketing, but more specifically that they this should be shouldn't have happened in the first place, right? The idea, what I'm saying is, they should have gotten authorization from the Players Association. Can you imagine if a game like that came out today? Hey, the next Madden game, not gonna have any player names in it. Nobody would buy that game, or if they did, they would sue the hell out of EA, and probably win, right? Because we have certain expectations now that we maybe didn't have back then, right? The courts conceivably then could have been like, hey, it still works, it's still a game that plays, it's not, it doesn't have all the features or whatever. But as we've seen in the recent past, I mean, when game companies fail to deliver on their promises, they get sued a lot of times. Like, people freak out when that happens, right? Okay. What's that?
That about the name thing. I mean, that's not. I mean, even you look at the college football games, they didn't have players' names. NCAA football, talking about Madden, same company, up until 2014, and then you have LeVar Arrington wouldn't give permission, and so he was linebacker 55, I think I watched that, and then Michael Jordan's on an NBA Jam for the same.
Correct. Yeah. No, that's actually a good point, because there is something to be said about the fact that sometimes, like, okay, so Charles Barkley, for example, is not in any NBA games, and his rationale is because he was like, not everybody was like me. Not everybody made a ton of money playing basketball. There were plenty of guys that were on the team with me that played the entire time I played, the entire time of my career, that made good money, but not like the kind of money I was making. And no one wants to give them any money to include them in the games. And he said, pay them the back money that they're owed, and then I'll give my permission eventually, in that scenario. So yeah, there is something to be said for, I mean, you can't always do it. Now, in the modern era, and I'm talking, in the past a couple of years, to have an entire game that had no player name, like there was none at all, I feel like that would be a really bad move. Now, if you can't get a person here and there, or like you said, before they worked everything out with the NCAA games and stuff like that.
They just don't make it anymore.
Do they not?
They stopped in 2013 or 14.
Did they really? See, I didn't know they'd stop. And because of that kind of stuff, I would assume, because they didn't want to pay for likeness rights and things like that, probably.
Yeah, for the most part.
For the most part, yeah. So anyway, legacy and later versions of the NES. So there on the far left is the NES Mini, which looks pretty much identical to the little RetroPie that we made. There in the middle, that's Contra being played on Nestopia, the emulator. The third thing there is a game, Super Mario World, being purchased on the Wii Shop, on the Wii Shop channel. And the fourth one over there, anybody know what the fourth one over there is? It's the top loader NES. It's region free. It's the only version of the NES that is region free. And it's a top loader, and it also has the dog bone controller. That's what they call this, which you may notice like heavily resembles a Super Nintendo controller, just without the shoulder buttons and the X and Y buttons. Okay. Now let's watch this. So the era has ended. Okay. Now there are a couple quick things I want to mention before we move on and watch this video. There was also the Sega Master System was out at this time. The Atari 5200 was out at this time. that sort of thing. But for all intents and purposes, once the Super Nintendo launched, this era ended. Okay, even though it had competitors, and I didn't talk about any of them. The reason is because none of them really made a splash. Like the Sega Master System, no one's ever heard of the Sega Master System, really. You know, if you've played a game from the Sega Master System, it was because it was released as a compilation on some other platform, right? The era has ended, and people are finding themselves kind of in a weird situation, which is the Super Nintendo has come out. It's 16-bit, plays higher resolution games, it can have more sprites on screen, things like that. But it isn't backwards compatible with the NES. And there are kids and families that sunk a lot of money into the NES and the game library that they have at home. And so, what do you do? What do you say to all those people who are saying, oh, I'm not about to go drop $500 on a new console and a whole bunch of games? What do you do? Well, let's find out.
When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come: the games of Super Nintendo.
In 1993, the North American console wars were in full swing, with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis competing for the top spot in the market. Developers and manufacturers were hard at work to make the next great 16-bit games and accessories. But one company was stuck in the past: Camerica. Camerica thought it would be wiser to appeal to the more than 30 million consumers who already had an 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System. So in 1993, they announced the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, a device you could plug into your NES and play special proprietary compact cartridges. Why? Because not only did the Aladdin promise additional memory and graphics power, but the cartridges were $30 to $40 less than a traditional NES cartridge. Never heard of it? That's no surprise. Camerica quickly went under after the product was announced in January of 1993. It's questionable if the Aladdin Deck Enhancer ever got a retail release, and it's mostly only known today in collector circles. So, let's take a look at the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, the company behind it all, and why it faded into obscurity. Camerica was founded as a giftware wholesaler in 1987 by David J. Harding. Based out of Ontario, Canada, Camerica sold items such as porcelain bears, pottery, and crystal glassware to gift shops, but they soon got into the fast-growing video game business. Their first products were wireless controllers for the Nintendo Entertainment System, such as the Freedom Stick and the Supersonic Joystick.
Set you free! No wires!
Camerica also made the Freedom Connection, which turned any controller into a wireless controller. They had a few wild ideas teased in magazines, including a portable Nintendo Entertainment System called the Nintendo Express, but they were never released. Camerica really hit it big in 1990 when they released the Game Genie, a device that allowed players to add and create cheat codes for their NES games. A video game company based out of the UK known as Codemasters developed the Game Genie. When founders Richard and David Darling went to Nintendo to inquire about licensing, they were turned away. So instead, they licensed the device to Camerica. To help with distribution outside of Canada, Camerica licensed the Game Genie to toy company Galoob, which would distribute the device throughout the United States and Europe. Nintendo quickly sued everyone involved to prevent the Game Genie from coming to market, but ultimately Nintendo lost the lawsuit. The Game Genie went on to sell more than 2.5 million units. It was so popular that Codemasters made versions for the Game Boy, Game Gear, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo. The Game Genie also helped establish a strong relationship between Camerica and Codemasters. The two companies formed an agreement where Camerica would essentially become the sales distribution arm for Codemasters products. Camerica decided to publish several of Codemasters' games as unlicensed Nintendo cartridges, The cartridges were either gold or silver, and each one had a switch on the back to get around the NES lockout chip. Depending on the version of NES hardware, players would set the switch to either A or B. The switch essentially crashed the NES lockout chip, allowing the games to play. They put out several titles, including Stunt Kids, Super Robin Hood, and The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy. Camerica relied heavily on grassroots advertising. They would release titles to rental stores 30 days in advance so players could try the games out before buying them. They also advertised on the Home Shopping Network. HSN got 30-day exclusivity before the games hit stores. They even signed 1990 Nintendo World Champion Thor Ackerlund to an endorsement deal. Ackerlund promoted the games in magazines, commercials, and on the Home Shopping Network. Camerica games weren't sold at massive toy chains like Toys R Us, but they were widely available at department stores like Walmart, and smaller chains like Electronics Boutique and KB Toys. Camerica and Codemasters' unlicensed games sold relatively well, but the biggest problem was developer costs. Making unlicensed games was expensive and time-consuming, and the profit margins weren't great. Richard and David Darling of Codemasters thought there could be a better way, and they came up with the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. Traditional NES cartridges contain several components, including the game ROM chip and security chip. The problem was, every time a cartridge had to be made, every single component had to be included, making costs high. Codemasters took most of the chips and put them inside the Deck Enhancer. On the game cartridges was just the game ROM. Therefore, companies could develop games without having to pay for extra chips on every cartridge, which would make games significantly cheaper. Camerica thought the idea was brilliant and agreed to license and distribute the device. While a large portion of the gaming population was moving on to the 16-bit systems, there were more than 30 million NES systems already out there. In fact, many parents were upset that the 16-bit Super Nintendo wasn't backwards compatible with the NES and refused to upgrade.
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to explain to him how people market things to make you spend more money.
Camerica thought they could take advantage of the lack of new NES games by introducing the Aladdin with various budget titles. It could extend the life of the system. In 1992, at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, Camerica teased their new product, which at the time was called the Aladdin System. A Swedish magazine, Nintendo Magasinet, seemed to like the idea, but also stated, "What Nintendo's lawyers have to say about this, we don't know." On January 7th, 1993, at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, Camerica unveiled their new device, the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, to the public. The Deck Enhancer itself would retail for $39.99 and come packaged with a game. Additional games would cost between $17.99 and $19.99. At the time, Camerica was only planning to release the Aladdin Deck Enhancer in North America. Camerica president David J. Harding boasted, "Our Aladdin Deck Enhancer is like a wish in hard times for families that have longed for quality video game entertainment at a recession-busting price." So, now that you know more about the history, let's talk about the actual device. Let's take a look at the packaging. The bottom right corner says the Deck Enhancer will upgrade your Nintendo Entertainment System. Oh, that's interesting. Upgrade it with what? According to the back, the Deck Enhancer has a 64K memory upgrade for better graphics and bigger games. But this is all just marketing hype. The Aladdin Deck Enhancer is no different than a standard Camerica cartridge. Inside the box is the Deck Enhancer with instructions, along with a Dizzy the Adventurer cartridge, and a poster manual for the game. Believe it or not, there are two versions of the Deck Enhancer. The first version has an A-B switch, just like their unlicensed games. This is to get around the NES lockout chip. Version 2 removed the switch as they found a way to automate the whole process. A word of caution, the Aladdin Deck Enhancer only works with the original toaster design of the Nintendo Entertainment System. If you try to use it on a top loader, it could potentially fry your system. It also needs the NES lockout chip to work, so it doesn't work with third-party consoles like the Retron or the Analog NT Mini. To use the device, just plug in a compact cartridge into the deck enhancer, then use it like you would any NES cartridge. They even come out to about the same size. So how about the games? The Aladdin Deck Enhancer only had 7 games, and besides the pack-in title, all of them had previously been released as a standalone cartridge. Camerica did tease future titles on the back of the box, but the company didn't last long enough to release any of them. We'll start with the pack-in title, Dizzy the Adventurer. This is a port of Dizzy, Prince of the Yoke Folk, which was released on several computer platforms, including the Commodore 64 and Amiga. Your goal is to rescue your girlfriend Daisy, who is locked away in a castle. The best way to describe this game is an adventure platformer. Rather than attack enemies, Dizzy must collect items and use them to solve puzzles. It's fun trying to figure out which items Dizzy needs to use to get around certain obstacles. You'll also get to interact with a bunch of different characters, including Dizzy's, pet, Hoagie. The Dizzy games were made by the Oliver twins, a pair of developers who collaborated with Codemasters on many titles. They made a lot of Dizzy games. There are more than 15 titles in the franchise. But as far as Dizzy the Adventurer goes, it's a lot of fun. Once you beat it, it's not as exciting since you know what to do the second time around, but it's still one of my favorite games on the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. Next up is Micro Machines. Micro Machines is probably the most well-known game from Camerica, thanks to the popularity of the toy franchise. This is a top-down racer where you get to race with different Micro Machines in scaled-down racetracks, like in a bathtub or on a table. You also get to choose your racer, and it's me? As you win races, you'll add cars to your Micro Machines collection. This is another fun title on the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. We're 2 for 2 so far, but as I mentioned earlier, you can also buy this game as a standalone cartridge. Now let's look at Big Nose Freaks Out. This is a platformer where your goal is to collect all of your stolen bones. But instead of walking on 2 feet, Big Nose rolls around on a wheel. It almost feels like a Sonic game. Momentum plays a big role in making some jumps, and you can even launch off of ramps. Collecting power stones gives you a projectile you can fire, but once you get hit, you lose the power-up. Get hit again, and you're dead. Jumping on mushrooms reveals power-ups, but it can also cause problems. Sometimes it will cause a lightning storm, or even reverse your controls. Big Nose Freaks Out is a decent platformer, but can be a bit of a challenge. There's also no music in any of the levels, which was an odd choice. I found the prequel, Big Nose the Caveman, more enjoyable. Camerica was planning to release this on the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, but it never came out. Here we have 4 games in 1 with Quattro Sports. The 4-in-1 cartridges were unique to Camerica, and they marketed them heavily in their advertisements. Unfortunately, most of these games are poor. First up is Baseball Pros, featuring teams from around the world, including the Fightin' Bears of Moscow. This game is bogged down by issues. Fielding the ball is almost impossible. You can only control your pitcher in the infield, and you can't move your outfielders until the ball passes a certain point. There's also no force outs. You have to tag everyone to get them out. Luckily, you can easily throw a no-hitter by throwing sliders over and over. The CPU just refuses to swing at this pitch. Next is BMX Simulator. This is another top-down racer. I just couldn't get the hang of this game. It was extremely difficult to control my guy, and I kept running into stuff. The third game is Soccer Simulator. Everything in this game just feels very slippery. I feel like I never really have full control over what's going on. I actually think it's faster to slide tackle around the field than to actually run. You can't switch players either. The CPU will just select the closest player to the ball. Overall, a pretty frustrating experience. And finally, there is Pro Tennis Simulator. The ball physics in this game just feel off. The only way to properly serve the ball is when it's down by your face, which doesn't make much sense. You'll also feel lucky just to hit the ball. Quattro Sports is a mess. Thor, you lied to us all.
Quattro Sports gives me 4 great games on one cartridge. Quattro Baseball is incredible.
Let's move on to Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade. You play as an alien named Linus who must prove to his buddies that he discovered the planet Earth. This is another platformer adventure game, but with more of an emphasis on platforming. The problem is the controls. Controlling Linus is a chore. You can't change direction mid-air, so once you commit to a jump, there's no correcting it. Linus sometimes just won't stop moving, making platforming extremely difficult. I gave up on this game pretty quickly. Here is another 4-in-1 cartridge. This time it's Quattro Adventure. Does it fare any better than Quattro Sports? Yes, it does. The first title is, oh boy, another Linus Spacehead game. It suffers from the same issues as Cosmic Crusade. Hard pass. Next is Super Robin Hood. This is another game from the Oliver twins, the creators of Dizzy. You play as Robin Hood, making your way through a dungeon and collecting keys and treasure. You also have a bow and arrow you can shoot to defeat enemies. It reminds me a lot of Lode Runner, which is a good thing. The third game is Boomerang Kid. This feels like an old school arcade game. The goal is to collect boomerangs and exit as fast as possible, all while avoiding the dangers of the outback. Despite being the Boomerang Kid, you don't actually get to throw a boomerang. You also can't fall from heights, or you'll lose a life. It's not a bad game, but it's also not a very exciting one. The final game in Quattro Adventure is Treasure Island Dizzy. This is similar to Dizzy the Adventurer. You collect items to solve puzzles and get past obstacles. However, it doesn't run as smoothly. It's also more difficult because you only get 1 life. This is frustrating because there's a lot of gotcha traps in the game, so it's a lot of trial and error. We have reached our final game, The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy. This is the biggest Dizzy game on the NES. It also won Best Adventure Game in Game Players magazine. Dizzy's girlfriend Daisy has once again been kidnapped and you have to rescue her. This is your standard Dizzy game. Collect items to solve puzzles and traverse obstacles. And it's much bigger than Dizzy the Adventurer. The Aladdin Deck Enhancer version of this game is slightly different than the standalone cartridge. It plays a little faster and gives you 250 stars to collect instead of 100. Overall, another fun Dizzy game. Camerica had big plans for the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. They set aside $3 million for advertising and expected the device to account for 60% of their business in 1993. Camerica planned to release more than 35 games for the device that year. Magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly wrote up previews. Codemasters was exploring making a version of the device for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. On paper, the future looked bright for Camerica and the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, but the reality of the situation was much different. Internally, Camerica had major issues. Due to poor product quality, retailers got a lot of returns on Camerica products, including their joysticks and unlicensed games. Camerica's giftware division struggled due to an economic recession. Gift shops had trouble moving product, and Camerica was stuck with tons of inventory. By June of 1993, less than 5 months after the Aladdin Deck Enhancer was announced, Camerica filed for bankruptcy. It's not clear if the Aladdin Deck Enhancer ever got released. There are no known advertisements of it being for sale. If it did get out, it was a very limited release. So if the Aladdin Deck Enhancer was never released, how am I holding one right now? Well, in 1996, a store based out of New Jersey called Video Game Connections bought a ton of old Camerica inventory from a liquidator out of Brooklyn, New York. The store owner estimated there were between 5,000 and 10,000 deck enhancers, with similar quantities of each game. Over the years, even more liquidators began selling them. Listings soon popped up on eBay, and the rest is history. Even today, you can buy an Aladdin with every game brand new for about $100. The idea of the Aladdin Deck Enhancer isn't a bad one at all. Imagine if Nintendo included the standard cartridge chips within the Super Nintendo. Games would be way cheaper, since publishers would only have to manufacture the game's ROM chip. But Camerica simply didn't have the resources to launch a product like the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. The Aladdin also failed simply because it was a device for the NES. Yes, the Nintendo Entertainment System had a huge user base in 1993, but the industry was moving on to 16-bit systems. Said one former Camerica employee, "It was never going to work. We were 2 steps behind on the dance." That's all for this episode of The Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so pretty interesting, right? Fun little fact, that last Dizzy game he showed, I actually own the cartridge version of that for the NES. It's a gold cartridge like he was talking about. And it's actually it's somewhat rare. It's not rare enough that I can like finance my kid's college education with or anything like that, but I mean, it's a conversation piece. It's one of those kind of game, similar to, a little less rare than the Zelda game you brought me yesterday. You know, it's one of those that like if someone sees it, they'll be like, "Oh, that's cool. Where'd you get that?" And you kind of talk about it a little bit and things like that. But yeah, they were trying to sort of not pander to, but cater to the parents, like that lady that we saw that said, "I'm going to say no to the Super Nintendo. I'm going to explain to him that people market things in a certain way." It's called planned obsolescence, by the way, to make you spend more money, right? And we'll talk about this next week when we get into the 16-bit era to the console wars. But the Sega Genesis had an adapter for Master System games. So if you bought the Master System, I'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but it had 2 different styles of cartridges. The first kind looked like a credit card, sort of, and there's very few of those. Like they weren't very popular. They were very fragile. So like if you get one of those are actually worth quite a bit of money because there were so few of them made. The other ones are just regular little small cartridges, and they made an adapter for the Genesis. So if people had sunk money into the Master System, they could just play those same games on the Genesis without having to hook up a different system. Now, what we will see as we discuss the 16-bit era is the idea that Sega kind of took that to the extreme, and they started doing things like, okay, well, let's just make adapters for everything. Like instead of releasing like a new console, let's just release another add-on. And you eventually get to a point where you have like a CD add-on with like a 32X add-on, like all these things stacked up on top of each other, doing all this different stuff, when it probably would have made more sense just release a new console. Okay, any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, or ideas? Alrighty, come back at 10:25. And we will start talking about our semester project as well as an individual semester